Welcome to this series of podcasts on the beauty and power of liturgical art. Created through the Chichester Workshop for Liturgical Art and our associates, we explore how God reveals himself to us through the material world, and how we, as a union of matter and spirit, can worship God through works of material beauty.
Welcome to Chichester Cathedral. I have with me a variety of theologians and liturgical artists, beginning with Dr. Dan Inman, who's the precentor here at the Cathedral, Dr. Farey, who's a Catholic trained in theology and philosophy, Aidan Hart, a liturgical artist, and Dr. Jim Blackstone, who's another liturgical artist, and I'm Vanessa Baron, Canon Treasurer. We're standing here in the Mary Magdalene Chapel, and behind us is Graham Sutherland's painting of Mary Magdalene meeting the risen Christ, Noli me tangere. It was the first commission made by Walter Hussey when he was dean here and introduced a tradition of commissioning famous artists to work in a liturgical context. But a question to begin our discussion is, what do you think is the theological or philosophical basis for figurative art in the Christian tradition? Is there any? Who's going to kick off?
I mean, this was a big question, of course, that was raised in the first Roman Pontificate by Byzantium, and the Church definitively decided, because God has become flesh, become visible, we can do God as the Lord Jesus Christ, the Logos, become flesh. But then, of course, also, he's broken down the barrier of death. So therefore, we also, and right from the first centuries of the Church, we have frescoes of saints, people who have died. So imagery of not just of Christ, but also the saint is important to show that there's only one church, those in heaven and those on earth are together as one body of Christ. Without that visual representation, I don't know, Christianity can so easily become just a philosophy or a moral system or whatever. But with these spaces around you, you know that it's all to do with relationship. Christianity's relationship, not just origins or isms.
We're going to discuss this further later, but I wonder if you've got anything to say.
Well, I'd like to just add, because I agree with everything Aidan said, of course. St. Augustine used this phrase, Christus totus, Christ, the whole Christ, which is Christ and his church, and therefore, because he became flesh, the Word became flesh, therefore, in and through his church, we meet Christ, and therefore, the incarnation is the theological basis for art. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 really emphasised that we can have images in our places of worship, in our homes, and in the streets, it even says. But linked to that and linked to this painting, the Word, and of course the Word is the Son of God, but also the Scriptures. So when we have artistic representations of the Word made flesh, we want it to be completely in unity and in harmony and accurately with the Scriptures. So for liturgical art particularly, it's very important. And this doesn't do that. It's a modern re-understanding of the event. Which can be used for all sorts of interesting purposes. It can be, but well, we can talk about this later as well. It does not help as liturgical art.
It's got to embody theology in its form, not just a subject matter, you're saying, perhaps.
We would definitely agree on both the content and the form, and we can talk about the form, because this is where beauty comes in as well. Art for the liturgy's sake.
Yes,
I don't want to tell you about it.
Exactly. It's always very interesting when I came to the cathedral. I think the first time I had to preside at the Eucharist was at this altar on a Monday morning, and it was a very odd experience. It's hard to put into words, but I suppose it's the way in which good liturgical art is a window into heaven, and heaven looks at you also. I never really found it with this piece, and I think it's one of Hussey's. I think it's probably his best commission. And I'm drawn to it in a variety of ways. And observing visitors, they'll come, they'll adopt their gallery posture as they look at it. They're not necessarily drawn into worship.
No, or into a chapel.
Jim, what are your reflections?
Well, only to add what's already been said and to move it a little bit. But to think of, and to pick up on that expression, face to face. So I think the original question is about the position of figurative art, and I think to add to that, there's a sense of face to face with Christ. Who Christ looks at us, we look at Christ. He's the image of the invisible Father, and we see his image primarily in the way he expresses that, and through eyes and the rest of the face. So just to narrow down the focus on figurative, to say yes to that, and to add positive accent upon the face within the figure.
Relationship. You're not looking at a picture of the past, you're looking at a saint Christ who's with you present. Yeah.
And one of the problems, I think, with this chapel, I've never presided here at the Eucharist, but we have a barrier there, and actually the congregation are kept away. And you're talking about relationship. Well, actually, the picture is so distant, you can't actually really see it.
Yes, I'm surprised how small it was, actually. I had it in the window, but yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's a reminder, I think, that liturgical art doesn't stand alone, it's used in a context.
Or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
The challenge here, I guess, which we'll explore in our conversation between gallery art and liturgical art.
That's the point of discrimination.
Yes. We've moved to be in front of one of the cathedral's greatest treasures, 12th century carved stone reliefs of the raising of Lazarus. And so the question I want to ask my colleagues now is, with liturgical art, what are you hoping for it to achieve?
That's a really important question because it is functional, isn't it, as part of worship. So our question is, what is it there for? And I think one thing is that it's a means of communion with the persons depicted. It always fascinates me how in Orthodox services, say if it's Lazarus Saturday, they don't say, and let us piously think about the event 2,000 years ago. You know, they say, Christ today is crucified, today Christ is risen. We participate in that. So I think one role is to be at the door so we can participate in that. So if it's a portable image, it might be brought out on that feast. And so the hymns would bring you into contact with that feast. It's not just thinking about a past event.
It might be worth just moving back to like the basics of sacred art is art for a sacred place, which is therefore a sacred act. So it's the whole reason for sacred art in a sacred place is for the sake, I would suggest, of liturgy. And so it's to enhance that which takes place as a liturgical act. So it's there to promote, support, enhance, direct the view to the mysteries that are taking place in the liturgical act. And of course, anything that's of Christ, and this is the two women praying, isn't it? That Christ will raise Lazarus from the dead. And so we're right at the heart, if you like, of.
It's Lord, if only you'd been here.
Yes.
Pleading. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether Vanessa knows actually, but I mean, the question of how these were used liturgically in the 12th century, I don't know to what degree we know. I mean, I got the impression it would have been part of a series of reliefs.
Yeah, a series of probably 8 to 12 reliefs, we don't know. We're having to base that assumption on French examples. And also, when they were they were moved from having been discovered high up in the choir. So there's a very big question, as to how visual they were when they were in their original context.
And they would have been painted.
They would have been painted, and
the
recesses in the eyes are where the jewels or the stones would have gone.
So you can see the holes.
Yeah, you can, really quite clearly. But I think that, to me, even if it wasn't particularly visible, the story couldn't be fully understood. What was in the mind of the artist, as he, presumably a man, as he was creating this for a sacred place?
When you have the bosses, like right in the ceiling, they're there to lead people up the nave, aren't they, to the great event of the sanctuary. So it's interesting that the eyes would have had glass or stones to presumably to attract attention, even from high up.
Jim, as a maker of liturgical art, maybe I missed that. Can you make some comment? I'm interested in your comments on, say, how the garments are done, very Romanesque. Do you think there's theological content in the how the scene is depicted? Because everything's quite abstracted. we talk about what liturgical art is there for. Is there something in the form of the style that also touches the soul, or do you think it's just an arbitrary thing?
Well, it's a leading question. I mean, it's not going to be
It's a leading question.
The question's phrased. So the garments will reflect the figure, and they will emphasize the dynamic of the figures which we've discussed in part in relation one to the other. The abstraction suggests that figuration in a physically representative style entire is not going to do the job of representing or enhancing the liturgical act that we've spoken of. So the abstraction leads away from a sense of the fulfillment of a person in an entirely materially based universal perspective. So I think also picking up on your point that one is communing with a saint, and there's the liturgical act and the ongoing prayer of Christ to his Father, in which we're invited to be unified. There is in liturgical art a union of the earthly with the heavenly, on earth as it is in heaven, and we're moving into that eternal, unified, complete, fulfilled presence of the divine.
That's what I find so captivating about these, that although there are 2 reliefs dedicated to Lazarus, which if there were only 8, that's quite a significant investment in that story. But if it were sort of a frontispiece to the sanctuary, that within the whole cathedral's building, you would have been entering into the eternity, or it's a kind of a forecourt to eternity with this, which of course the story of raising Lazarus is in John's Gospel. It's a signpost to what Jesus is going to achieve in Jerusalem. In that sense, it's tantalising the thought about what that drama might have looked like in the 12th century, and how you would have entered the courts of heaven as you progressed through the cathedral.
And how some of the liturgy itself might have reflected that,
Exactly right.
particularly on his feast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And this is certain hierarchy, isn't it? Christ is bigger than the others, so it's not just depicting it as a photograph taken, but they're adjusting things to reveal hidden truths.
And the depth of emotion that are captured in this relief, I think, is quite extraordinary.
Well, and people went mad for them when they were discovered in 1829. It wasn't just, I don't think purely for art history purposes. I think there was a sense of something had been recovered and unveiled to the religious mind of Victorian England, Georgian England, through the recovery of these priceless and very important reliefs.
And there's no sentimentality to them, because a lot of Victorian arts are sentimental. There's a real vigour to this.
Yeah, and direct communication. Yeah.
I mean, to my mind, as a member of the Orthodox Church, the Romanesque is the height of Western iconography. You bring together enough social stability, artistic stability, but a very strong monastic life and spiritual life. These come together and you get incredible works. The illuminated manuscripts by Hugo, Master Hugo, all these things are just astounding.
Yeah, it's a collection, indeed.
And while I know we're considering liturgical art, I think it's worth remembering that Henry Moore stood in front of these as a very young man and then recorded that actually for him it was one of the turning points in his own artistic sort of development.
Wow.
But that does give hope, I think, for the church as a whole, all traditions about the way in which these pieces can still speak of heaven to us. And the way you see people just looking at them being looked at by, particularly in the next relief along, by Martha and Mary, and the deep grief and love expressed in those eyes, into which people are drawn into the sacred mysteries, I think, through these representations.
And perhaps the fact that they're not naturalistic sort of wakes you up a bit. You think, why has it done that way? What's done that way? It's not just, it's a nice scene. It forces them to go into themselves a bit. Why?
The kind of disruption of perspective.
And it is quite noticeable that people linger in front of these 2 reliefs. They don't just pass by.
Yes. The intensity of prayer with these really upwards and then Christ literally from the base right to the top. I mean, this is a tremendous sign of this prayer to the great Christ. Never mind, if you like. Okay, you've got all the sadness, but there's something else going on here, which, like you say, we're just going to see in the next one.
Will be mirrored by the unravelling of Lazarus.
I want to finish so we can look at the most recent work here.
Absolutely. Let's move across to the further across to the move across the retrochoir. We're here now in front of one of the cathedral's most recent commissions, a mosaic of St. Dominic, and we also have the artist who created it. This appears to work very well liturgically. So, Jim, could you tell us what are your insights as to why this has been such an effective piece of liturgical art?
Well, I think I'll take the notion of the artist who created it and broaden that, because we worked here, and I say we, myself and my colleagues specifically, but Aidan being up in Shrewsbury as a group, and Dan's vision and your support, Vanessa, here in the cathedral all together. So I want to broaden that out, and hearing the music of the place, hearing visitors coming up and talk from all kinds of backgrounds, knowing that the congregation here in the cathedral were praying for the project, praying for the work that Martin and I were making within that space. So yes, an artist, but I really want to broaden it out, because I feel that anything of success that works for people here, if there is that, is a product of a community. And that was also a conscious process to open out and empty out to some extent into what gifts were available here, to appreciate those, to be encouraged to, and to be actively, be thankful for the gifts that were here. And hopefully that comes through in some measure. So that's my thinking in response to why it might work, because it's from community, within community, under God, for community.
Yeah, I just to sort of add to that, I suppose, just to give some context for people who don't know what happened, that we had a residency and built a studio in the north transept of the cathedral. And really, based on what you just said there, Jim, I think there was this sense of, it wasn't just like an artist just working on any piece of work. You had kind of created a cell of prayer in the middle of the transept, which captivated people at a very deep level, I think, and which really underlines that central point that liturgical art is undertaken within the life of prayer, within the church and for the church, and to have that continuity between the studio in the community and Dominic here, which actually wasn't intended for here initially. In fact, it was intended for the Canon's vestry, but people were so indignant about the fact that they wouldn't be able to see Jim's work once it had been completed that we said, well, we better put it on show for a bit so people can appreciate it. And what has been fascinating has been the way in which people have responded to this piece. So when you come in the evening, this candle stand is full of candles. Wow. In the way in which it is not in front of the Sutherland. There's something about the radiance and the way in which Dominic looks at you. I think you are seen by this character. I'm not sure many people know who Dominic is necessarily. There are certainly some people who are really drawn to him because he is Dominic. But I think there's something about the presence and again that sort of the light of Christ fractured through his saints who share in becoming divine themselves, and this in itself acts as a kind of window into something quite different, I think, in the context of the west end of the cathedral, which is surrounded by, perhaps what I was referring to earlier as gallery art. So I think it has provoked some sharp responses from people who love the modern art, saying, we don't do this sort of thing. Chichester is not, this is not what we're about, and yet the candles keep being lit, and that's evidence enough for me that it's doing its work.
The candles being lit reminds me, and you can say more, of the great Basilica of San Clemente in Rome, which is looked after by the Dominicans, but it has a tremendous apse, and I think for liturgical art, it's the pinnacle, probably in my view, for Western art. But what they describe, what they explain is that where you have the gold tesserae at the back, obviously you would know, the gold tesserae behind the whole of that apse and behind here, the tesserae are deliberately not set flat, they're deliberately set at an angle to catch the light of the candle. So in there, and presumably here as well, here's the figure coming out of what is called the communion of saints, because these are the lights in heaven, all the lives in heaven who've caught the light of Christ are shining out. And here's one in the midst of those that we actually have his face, which, if I may say, is really very beautifully done. It's important that the faces for today's people today, we need faces that are like that, full of care, intensity, invitational,
And love, yeah.
quite beautiful.
It's a strength and gentleness, and I think good sacred art unites opposites, inverted commas. You don't want a saint who's just all soppy and soft. You don't want one that shouts at you. You want one strong but gentle, and that face has come to it. But it's not as though it's just your individual brilliance to do that. You're working within a tradition. You sort of draw on the wisdom, and no, it's a new face. Immediately it's a German-made face. So you sort of, did you feel you were standing on the shoulders of others when you made this?
It was, being under others. I mean, most directly Martin, who I mentioned, was guiding me through this process, which was a new process, and largely, and that was to demonstrate that precisely this handing on of skills within a tradition in which, over a period of years, and it takes time, doesn't it, you're formed to understand what's important, what's essential, what's less, what's disposable, and that comes into the heart out of which things should, I suppose, naturally, with some analytical correction, flow.
Yes, because I studied mosaic in Revd under a great master there, and then Martin studied under me.
Yeah.
Then you study under him. So it's an ongoing tradition.
Yeah.
And we're always responding. It's not to say we're copying, we're not glorified photocopiers.
Right.
But in fact, it struck me how in science we made the progress that we have, because each scientist first learns what's gone before, then they add the bit, they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. But that's the funny thing about modern art. You think to prove your originality, you've got to cut yourself off from the past. You don't want to be copying the past, but it's hubris to think you can just get everything straight from heaven.
I'm picking up on what you were saying earlier about that union between visual arts and the Word of God. I'm immediately reminded of Paul writing to Timothy and saying, passing on the Word, from faithful men who will be able to teach others also.
That's what traditio
Yes,
is.
absolutely. Handing on.
Yeah. And of course, it's going to be a modern face because you're a modern man, but you've done it. So you've drawn from the tradition in an exquisite way. I mean, it also reminds me of those fantastic mosaics from the Hagia Sophia and from the very, very early centuries, in the way that you've caught what they, as we were talking about form, you've caught what they wanted to express, but you've done it in the 21st century.
I mean, part of the practical discipline that I was put under and I freely entered into was to study the Thessalonican mosaics, and we're drawing over and over, and just weeks on site here before thinking about entering into the mosaic proper. Draw. So that was part of the immersive process.
Perfect, yeah.
It's very practical,
Practical immersion,
really,
and then you do it yourself. That's the perfect traditio, isn't it? Perfect handing over it's the way the Holy Spirit works, because He doesn't deny Himself.
Phase of our discussion, we're going to talk a bit about art and sacred art, gallery art, sacred art. What strikes me, having studied a lot of this sacred art and making it, how there are lots of overlaps between what used to be thought of as discoveries or inventions by, say, impressionists or pointillists, but it's all there. Looking at the colours on the face, that's pointillism. And you have really high-key colours side by side, but your eyes blend those together like the pointillist did. So it's not such a great gulf. There's a lot of abstraction that Picasso used, multi-view perspective. It's there in the icon tradition, the sacred art tradition, and UNESCO.
Of course, one thing, it would have been part of I don't know about St. Dominic, but this kind of imagery would be part of an iconostasis, not really. It reminds me of the saints who would be along the rood screen. The old pre-Reformation churches where the rood screen still exists, and you've got the rows of saints or angels that are at the border, if you like. They're at the threshold of heaven, as you said, where heaven meets earth. They're at that threshold, so the congregation are aware that the saints, the angels, Our Lady, were all there, as it were, on that screen, and then they could look beyond the screen into the sanctuary, into the Holy of Holies.
Literally a door, a window, interface between
An interface, and everyone in the congregation would have seen, wow, we've got the saints, the angels there, that we will join when we, as we come forward. Beautiful.
I think it's probably time that we moved on. We've moved to the library, which is traditionally the place for reflection and reading and considering the tradition of the elders. So let's go back to the beginning of our discussion when we asked the question, what are the theological and philosophical foundations for liturgical art? And should we explore those a little bit in greater depth? Because very obviously, particularly in the Protestant tradition, but also much earlier, the figurative art tradition has been contested. So what do you think is the basis for figurative art in the Christian tradition?
Well, everything depends on the incarnation, doesn't it? I mean, so I think for liturgical art, people need to know Christ. They need to focus on him and the people of his church. So I would almost say it contrasts with Islam, for example, where they don't have any figures. And if you look at the old apses and Christian churches, it's packed with people, which I think is tremendous. I mean, it's a people church, isn't it? So I think figurative is essential. But of course, the whole of creation manifests the glory of God too, or as a reflection. So, but we I think Christian liturgical art needs to be realistic. Now, there's all sorts of ways of understanding that, but reality, God created reality so beautiful, the reality all around us, and it's all going to be recapitulated in Christ. So I would say figurative, but also realistic. Now, I don't necessarily mean not stylized, but there needs to be clarity in terms of what is it we're looking at. I've seen a postmodern work of art in a church, and everybody looks at it all the time with their face screwed up. They say, what does it mean? What is it saying? They're looking for it to be a symbol of something. They're looking for a sign. And everyone's trying to find, is it words? Are there figures? Are there faces? No. And it's so distracting because nobody can work it out, because we're looking for something that's going to point us clearly to the divine. Yeah.
And just being material, I think, not only to know God, but just to be a full human. Now, God made us with bodies with 5 senses. I was a Baptist when I first became a Christian, and I really appreciated the strong personal relationship with God and the deep knowledge of the Bible, but I felt something was missing. And I was always involved in the arts anyway, but just a human. I thought, well, what about the body? There's no talk about the body. So I went to a high church where there was smells and I had a lovely story from an old lady who always used to go to church, but she went through a rebellious period. But being a lady of habit, she kept going to this high church. And she told me this story herself. She sat at the back of the church, closed her eyes, blocked her ears, and said, Lord, I'm here out of habit, but I just don't want anything to do with you. And during the censing, the priest came around and the smell went up her nostrils. And a little voice said, I can't get in through your eyes or through your ears, but I can get through your nostrils. So there, fragrance sort of restored her to sanity, if you like. So the fact that liturgical art just affirms our physicality, that God created us as physical beings for a reason, not as an impediment, but as a means of communion.
The Word was made flesh, don't we say? The Word was made flesh, so that's...
And he wasn't ashamed to be made flesh.
No, exactly.
And interesting, I suppose, how some contemporary art does degrade the created. I mean, there's it is about sort of shock or kind of pulling apart without really knowing how to put it back together. Actually, what was beautiful about and what people were really fascinated when Jim was creating the mosaic and Martin was painting the crucifix was the raw materials whether it was the glass or the pigments, the extempore, these raw materials of creation offered back to God in worship, which I think probably speaks to the healing of whole creation, actually, that church should be a place where, as they say, heaven and earth, the worship is for healing. It's not just about conveying information.
Offered back, but in a transfigured way. He didn't just offer the Lord a tray of broken glass. It was transfigured.
Yeah.
Well, this is modern art. Contemporary trends tend to want to portray the brokenness of humanity, whereas we want in the churches, we want them to indicate, yes, that's how you come in, but the church is to give you the hope of the healing. This is as you've just said. So to have that the postmodern brokenness within a church, I think is the opposite of what the art should be doing. So the postmodern, the fragmented, or broken up, that does not give you the hope that actually Christ has come, or the healing. So we would say, wouldn't we, that we need art which has the harmony, the wholeness, the unity, the clarity and the proportion, which gives people right?
I think I'm going to play devil's advocate.
I was going to think of as well, so you stick your fork on.
Well, I immediately think of the cross, the huge cross in the old cathedral at Coventry, made out of broken, twisted metal from that war-torn church. And it's not very beautiful, and the cross isn't beautiful. So I think I can play devil's advocate in saying that, yes, beauty can be defined in many ways, but I'm not entirely convinced that all liturgical art has to be beautiful.
Because it's the Eisenheim altarpiece too, isn't it? It's the kind of for those who were suffering, to look upon the suffering of Christ, but see their hope and identification. Or you're still seeing your own suffering in the context of the cross, aren't you? It is still a doorway to something else, I suppose.
Well, the classical understanding of beauty isn't contrary to what you just said. So if I've misled people, because it's the unity, truth, and goodness, which radiates, and that's the splendour of it. So there's truth in the cross. I mean, that's and there's tremendous goodness. Of course, he's carrying the sins of the world, but it's the goodness of Christ. And so, but I do think unity is important. Those pieces have been brought together to form a cross. So if there's a unity there, I think the unity of is extremely important, because God is one and God is whole, and God wants to bring wholeness, and that's what the liturgy is for. So anything that's too fragmented, I think, is not going to help the message of Christ, of what he's doing by his grace.
Well, there's continuity there as well, interestingly, in the cross too, isn't there? But I think also depicting the saints, they're depicted as, yes, joyful because of that which we talk about of the heaven and earth united, but also sorrowful. And that's a question on, you talked to Farey, Vanessa, of different definitions of beauty, so that's what's up for debate here, I suppose, in part. But that questions some notions of beauty, that there's this quite sometimes distorted sorrowfulness to the figures that are depicted. At the same time as drawing people into the source of joy, which speaks of the heavenly and eternal reality. There's clearly a tension there, but coming back to the notion of reality, a tension in reality before the end times. So there's a looking forward and there's a coming of Christ from that to us, drawing us forward. So this play on time is partly expressed by a unity of sorrow and joy, which itself questions the notions that are perhaps widely held that beauty shouldn't necessarily take account of the ugliness and distress that is mercifully looked upon in the sorrowful countenance of the saints.
In fact, the Greek has a word which actually is two words together, which often is used to describe the faces of the saints in iconography. That's amolipia, bright sadness. The Slavonic has the same. So some people ask, well, why are these faces so sad? There's joy there as well. And I said, well, though the saints are in heaven and full of joy, out of love they still feel for your suffering. So it's a joyful suffering, a compassion, a co-suffering. But as you say, it's the you're saying it's a joining together of sadness and joy. It's not just sort of, oh, you poor thing, you're in the mud, and poor thing. You know, there's a joy and a hope next to it.
That's the richness of the soul, isn't it? So it's bringing through.
Yeah.
The flesh can do one thing, but of course it's trying to bring out the soul, the spiritual soul of the person, which can have these multiple aspects to the state of the soul.
Are we beginning to suggest that something like abstract art has no place in liturgical art?
I'm interested.
Good question.
The artist, I suppose. How do you feel about Christian sacred art, but which is obviously in a very modern register? And what place does that have?
My answer is twofold. It has a real place in liturgical art. I was 2 years a novice monk in Mount Athos at the Farey monastery, and the abbot often used to say, "I thought the paterne lay ora." This floor tells you everything, and it was a Cosmati floor, 1,000 years old. Jim and I were talking about this today, and it's pure geometry, made out of minerals. It's sort of circles going into circles and squares. It's like the one, of course, at Westminster Abbey. And there's a lot of theology in that. At a hermitage I made a simplified version, and it was theology and geometry, abstraction. So you had a square, which is the created world, had a circle in the middle, which is divinity. But then that circle, without any break, in a sort of Celtic spiral, went out into 4 circles, which are the evangelists or the life of Christ going into the world. But then there are 4 others, so altogether 8 circles, and that was kairos, divine time. So God enters into the 7 days of creation, dies on the 6th, rises on the 8th, outside of the 7-day creator time. So all the theology was in that. But I think also people like Kandinsky, they actually came from an Orthodox background. Brancusi, the founder of abstract sculpting, I've done some articles looking at the inspiration of Orthodox theology in their work, and there's a definite relationship. Admittedly, they're isolated from the figure, but if they're trying to, as it were, depict the fire without the bush, the essence of things. And Brancusi said, there are fools who call my work abstract in the sense of unreal. He said, what I give you is the reality, the essence of a bird in space. So for them, abstraction was to draw out what was there. Like an abstract of these books would give a summary, a distillation of them. It's not a departure from reality in the book. So I think, but then later, I think postmodernism used abstraction as an excuse just to fantasize, but original abstraction is the opposite. It was trying to get to the heart of albeit invisible reality. That's how I see it anyway.
But I wonder if the tension, people hearing the conversation might think the tension still remains between our great affirmation of the figurative earlier and this now affirmation of a Cosmati floor, which is entirely abstract and in the sacred space.
But it's part of the whole.
But that's it,
so there's a hierarchy of arts within.
Well, because you'd have the Cosmati on the floor, but you wouldn't have it behind on the sanctuary wall, because there you would want something that was really going to focus people's attention, rather than be something that you walked along.
And you wouldn't want to walk on figures of saints.
And you wouldn't want to walk on any figures. Yeah. So it's part of the decoration of the whole. And there's lots of architectural. I think of the Scroveni Chapel in Padua. There's more architectural work than there are. There's more architecture in the painting. But even the Sistine Chapel, there's so much architecture on that ceiling in between all the scenes. So there's plenty of space and scope for that.
But is there a distinction to be made between gallery art, as you were saying earlier, and sacred art? And I think there is a place for abstraction on gallery art, let's call it. What are your thoughts, Vanessa?
I think as well, yes, I very much like the distillation, the idea of distillation, which I think we saw downstairs in the figurative art, in the Romanesque figurative art actually, when those shapes really have been distilled just into very simple lines and form. And there's a huge difference between liturgical art and gallery art, to my way of thinking. And it's partly to do with space, and it's partly to do with use, and subject matter as well.
The purpose of it,
So it's just a trivial point, but I remember when I was a university chaplain that suddenly icons became incredibly trendy, and there's something countercultural about the icon. But there is, the icon does, as we were saying earlier, it does disrupt. It's not pure figurative representation, is it? And I think, and students were started buying them, and where can I get these? Fascinating that it spoke spoke afresh in quite a radical way, but again, that radical perhaps being taken to the root and being asked to look at it again, which of course good modern art has done. I suppose it has asked about the basic principles, and often it's just been a question mark. And I think we as Christians would want to have the confidence to say, to speak the word in the art, to interesting comparisons with music, which we haven't discussed, which I think, well, we're in the cathedral, although you didn't talk about the musicians, but and the choral tradition, which is the Anglican gift, perhaps, to liturgical art. But interesting there that the way in which the discordant has not lasted in the 20th century. The music which people are going back to and are drawn to is someone like Arvo Pärt, using some very simple, but again sort of rediscovered, but in a very modern register. But there's a continuity there, which is very distinct from like Eric Whittaker, which is just big squishy chords. But it's fascinating what endures and what people respond to in the same way.
It's what endures, yes, which really speaks to them.
One part of the human person that's been lost sight of the last few centuries is the nous, the eye of the heart. So if you forget that, then art either just sort of stimulates you by shocking you, but doesn't actually go to the heart, or it's just what your rational mind can comprehend. So I think sacred art's got to help go from the rational faculty, which likes to tidy everything, into the nous, the eye of the heart. And a lot of the church fathers say it's through the eye of the heart that we encounter God directly in an unmediated way. Before meeting you, Dan, I could have read about you, knew about you, but it's not until I'm with you that nous speaks to nous. So I think that's where a bit of the shock value comes into good liturgical art. It sort of wakes you up. And, why is that table being shown there, and there all at the same time? My rational mind doesn't understand that. Well, it's not supposed to. The nous understands, because I know that table's got a top, side and back, so the icon shows them all at the same time.
Yes.
So it reflects how experience, rather than just how the brain, in isolation, perceives things.
We've chosen to record this podcast not standing in front of the Piper Tapestry. And I think that's interesting in and of itself. And I don't think we can end this podcast without reflecting for a moment as to whether we think that tapestry actually works liturgically.
You're
Which
the
I know
ones
is
who
a
take
massive
services.
question.
You're the two to answer that. I think
Well,
you spend time here.
It's fascinating at the moment where we're trying to think about how do we enrich our liturgy and have this sense of being taken into the courts of heaven, and the degree to which that tapestry dominates every other question you ask, because it does dominate it by its colours. So it's a pain in the neck if you're trying to be creative, I would say.
Well, it doesn't take you into the courts of heaven.
Well, famously, one of my predecessors put on sunglasses at Evensong when it was first unveiled as a kind of catty comment. I think what it is successful, and maybe this is what Hussey was trying to do, was putting in the Arundel screen and this radiance at the high altar to which the eye was drawn through the glass windows. So actually there's a sense of people walking around the west end of the cathedral were taken somewhere. You might want to question how successful it is in doing that in its abstraction, particularly with no symbol of salvation really anywhere in the cathedral. I think it's a tricky. I have mixed feelings about it.
For me, the Piper Tapestry works from the west end of the cathedral because of its colour. And because the cathedral is very plain, and it's actually quite a small cathedral, and it draws if someone enters the cathedral, the Piper Tapestry does draw people right up into the east end, into the sanctuary.
Because of the colour?
Because of the colour. But then when you get there, then we're back into the problem of, when you're close to the tapestry, how can you read it, how do people understand it? And you see people looking at it and then searching for an explanation all the time. And then actually they very often don't even understand the explanation. And because the very word evangelist doesn't necessarily mean anything to people. And it's also very dated, which is quite interesting. And people will often say to me, that's quite old-fashioned, isn't it? So for something that's meant to be contemporary art, it sort of dates quite quickly. Jim, you have to...
Well, a reflection on the dedication of the Cathedral Church and the Holy Trinity, and the extent to which there's any clear exposition of the nature of the Holy Trinity, or presencing of the Holy Trinity for people in that space, or even seeing that space from the West End. I mean, you can still see quite a large section of the graphic form, I think, even from the West End. So you have symbols, quite geometric symbols, some quite organic, held together, banded together as separate elements. There seems to be an underlying sense of forms, of a Platonic inheritance of forms, as well as perhaps more another sense of organic development, perhaps more Aristotelian sense of observational world. And so those kind of categories, I think, work. But all that we're saying about the presence of Christ doesn't seem to be presented there. It's a beautifully effective piece and stunning piece in so many ways, but one that doesn't seem to express what's precisely presented there at the altar before it. I think that would be my sense of it, the expression of the Holy Trinity there.
I'm interested to ask why, in the 50s, 60s, there was this, it was all about colour, it's about the resurrection, there's a real resistance to the cross, even with the Chagall window, which is, I mean, it's wonderful in many respects, kind of exuberance, a song of praise to God through the glass. But I think something's probably missing, perhaps that's going back to what you were saying about what Coventry has, which is the other cathedral which did modern art in that period, although it all looks quite dated now there too. But what's the theological rationale which, for the whole building? I think that's the way in which it's a bit hit and miss, and I never really feel that there's an overarching rationale for the liturgy of the cathedral in the art, which as it's presented.
Yes, and certainly as we're trying at the moment to rethink our liturgical plan and consider our use of the high altar, actually how a priest stands in front of the tapestry is actually very, very, very difficult. How are they visible? How can anybody see anything?
If I really agree with you, I mean, I don't know how you do it. If the liturgical art there in the sanctuary is to manifest everything that manifest, proclaim, enhance, support, direct people's attention to what is actually taking place, then it does need to be clearly of heaven, because what's going on at the altar. Number one, God is coming to meet his people. It's heaven meets earth. We have the Paschal mystery present right there for the healing of the nations, and we have something that can encourage us all just to worship and adore. Adoration is that which unites us, and I think it's Paul VI said, saves us from despair. So that seems to be doing the opposite of giving the hope, the unity, the joy, the beauty of heaven. It does not seem to do what liturgy should do.
I have to be very careful. As a presenter, I find myself in a lot of trouble by condemning all these other works. No, it's fine. I enjoy it. I do sense joy there, actually. I think I would push back a bit, though. I do feel the colours, particularly for the church at the time, I think it spoke of warmth and light.
The colours are tremendous. I mean, but there's plenty of ways you can do colour.
Yeah. Well, and one of the questions now is, if you were to replace our vestments, and the tapestry dominates everything. So how does the rest of the liturgical
there's the harmony of the whole.
The harmony of the whole, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah. And is there reverence there? I mean, is there a sense of reverencing the Trinity that has deigned to come to us in the Son of God, as Jesus Christ, in the flesh? Is there anything in that gives us that sense of awe, wonder, and reverence for the Trinity, for the Paschal mystery? For
what Jim is saying really about it's giving you information, but I'm not sure to what degree it's sort of drawing you into the mystery of the Trinitarian life.
I think there's wonder before the intricacy of the tapestry. There's a sense of awe before the stunning nature of the colour. But the question is how that's aligned. Where does it take you? That question that recurs and it doesn't offer a sense of guidance towards that which we're talking about, but it is absolutely absorbing. And that's in itself perhaps a great sensation. And so the question then is, well, what about its place? And there's a quite interesting question, I think, about the extent to which abstract art might be somewhere in the church precinct, leading towards more figurative art. And there might be some really interesting plays on increasing figuration, increasing facial presentation on a person's physical and increasingly embodied, as you said earlier, this embodied or processional movement towards the central sanctuary. And that draws into the sense of the whole space, isn't it? The unified vision. And it's interesting, I don't know the details of Piper's brief or instruction, but I think there was some demand for changes, weren't there, in the design and so on, that weren't his responsibility as artist. So just to question whether he should be held responsible for what some of the more negative criticism that we're offering. So those would be my various kinds of.
And looking at the sculptural carving, not the figurative, the sculptural carving, like the dog-tooth designs, these are abstract art, and they have their place. It's a hierarchy. So that tapestry somewhere else, could do a job, but it's the placement, I think, determines some part of something successful. Like we don't have figurative work on the floor. You have a masterpiece, but you walk on it, so you don't have it on the floor, you have it somewhere else. So placement is important, I think, to find the success of something.
Definitely. There's a church in Oxford, and you know the artist, I think, James Gillick, where there's tremendous figures. I think the churches of St Gregory and St Augustine, and the two figures, very different, one in very rich robes and one very monastic, but they're both pointing down, as it were, to the altar. So you get a whole sense that the art is directing the saints in heaven are trying to say that. Something like that would be very different, wouldn't it, if it was St Richard saying, look what Christ is doing for us, right there on the altar through. That's the kind of art that you want behind the altar as a reredos, isn't it? That points straight back to what's happening here.
I think at that point, because you've brought us back to the very core of the Christian faith, it's probably time to draw this conversation to a close. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
you very much. No, it's been a wonderful experience.